Ethiopia's northern Tigray region will head to the polls on Wednesday in defiance of the federal government. This is seen as the latest challenge to Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed from a slew of regional leaders flexing their muscles ahead of next year's national elections. The federal government and major opposition parties agreed to postpone national and regional elections due in August until the COVID-19 pandemic was under control. Tigray, whose leaders dominated the previous administration and have often bitterly denounced Abiy, announced it would hold elections anyway. Tigrayans are only a small minority in the Horn of Africa nation of 110 million, but dominated power since 1991 when the Ethiopian People's Revolutionary Democratic Front drove a military dictator from power. The front was a coalition of 4 ethnically based parties, including the Tigray People's Liberation Front. Last year, 3 of the 4 parties in the coalition joined to create the New Prosperity Party under Abiy. The United States has announced that it will withdraw $100 million of aid to Ethiopia as a dispute continues with Egypt and Sudan over a dam that Ethiopia is building on the Nile River. The 3 countries have been locked in a bitter dispute over the filling and operation of the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam. Much of the U.S. funding affects deals with regional or border security, political competition and consensus building and nutrition. However, funding for HIV and AIDS, the Food for Peace program, international disaster assistance and migration and refugee assistance would be unaffected. Ethiopia says the dam will generate electricity and help lift its population out of poverty, but Egypt fears the dam will cause shortages in its water supply. The expert on Horn of Africa affairs, Dr. Awol Allo, is a senior lecturer at the United Kingdom's Keele University. He now joins us via Skype for more on this story. Dr. Allo, very good evening to you. Thanks for joining us. Welcome to the Globe.
Thanks for having me.
Let's talk about the dispute and the genesis thereof. I mean, the concept for this dam was first conceptualized by the Ethiopian Emperor Haile Selassie back in the 1960s. Now, let's talk about the dam's political, economic and cultural significance that has led to the dispute involving these 3 countries.
Absolutely, yeah. So there has been ideas of constructing a dam or exploiting the Nile River within Ethiopia because it's one of the most important natural resources dating back, as you said, to the Haile Selassie era. But it's actually Meles Zenawi, the Prime Minister who led Ethiopia from 1991 until his death in 2012, that planned and that made the political decision to construct the dam in defiance of international pressure, in protest, in the face of protests from Egypt. So the idea really is primarily that of the Prime Minister, but it's a national project with considerable political, cultural, and social significance for Ethiopia.
Well, inasmuch as officials cautioned that the details of these funding cuts are not yet cast in stone, but how likely will this harm the relationship between the United States and Ethiopia?
Well, unfortunately, the current administration in the U.S. has taken a very unusual approach. The president is very close to the Egyptian president, as he is very close to all highly authoritarian leaders around the world. And the Egyptian government wanted to use its very close relationship with the current United States administration to put pressure on Ethiopia. And the U.S. initially insisted to become part of the negotiating process. It wasn't really a neutral negotiating party, but ultimately when Ethiopia refused to accept the deal that's negotiated by the United States, then the United States tried to pressure Ethiopia, ultimately moved to cutting some aid from Ethiopia. So currently, I think you could say that relations between Ethiopia and the United States are not where they were in the past, but it's not clear to what extent this current move would affect the relations between the 2 countries. And this is also, an administration that is probably likely not to continue into the future. So, whether this would significantly affect the relationship between the two countries is something to be seen.
And having said that, what is the United States' expected role in the dispute in terms of fostering an agreement that would bind all three countries? And would I be correct to assume that the United States has got some sort of interest in this crisis?
Well, the United States' primary interest really is supporting the current Egypt administration. Whatever Egypt, in terms as a very powerful Arab nation, United States having a significant interest in the Middle East, particularly in terms of relations with Israel. So that relationship between Egypt and the United States, particularly the current administration, is really the key reason why the United States is, in this case, supporting Egypt over Ethiopia. But again, whether this would be a lasting policy of the United States government or whether it would be the lasting policy of the United States government or not, it's something to be seen. As you know, there is an election happening in the United States this November. The president really wanted very desperately to present this deal as one of his foreign policy achievements, but obviously the Ethiopian side did not agree to the deal. The United States tried to influence Ethiopia. Ethiopia refused. And then the U.S. obviously moved to withdrawing some aid from Ethiopia, which is one of the tools that it has in terms of promoting its foreign policies.
Now, the fact that Washington took a drastic decision that will, in the medium to long term, adversely affect Ethiopia, does this not show the Trump administration taking Egypt's side? I'm reading into a statement that President Trump made last year during the G7 summit when he called President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi as his favorite dictator.
No, absolutely. The United States is very clearly siding with Egypt in this case. And as I said, historically, the U.S. is closer to Egypt because of Egypt's significant influence in the Middle East and its proximity geographically to Israel, Israel being very close or one of the most closest allies of the United States. So maintaining warm, stable relations between Egypt and Israel requires proximity between the United States and Egypt. So from a geostrategic point of view, certainly Egypt is more important to the United States. And for this particular administration in the U.S., it's not just that long-standing relationship, but also the personal relationship between Sisi and President Trump is also very important.
Now, Egypt and Sudan, remember that they demanded that Ethiopia should not fill the dam until all three countries sign a legally binding deal that would sort of, address the water flows in that country. But then Ethiopia went ahead and announced a finalized phase of filling the dam. So is Ethiopia perhaps not disingenuous in this particular case by bulldozing their way around?
Ethiopia consistently said that it would start filling the dam with or without a deal. So Egypt and Sudan did insist that Ethiopia should not fill or start filling the dam without reaching a comprehensive deal. Ethiopia's position is that we will do everything we can to negotiate and reach a deal before we start filling the dam. But those agreements were not reached as planned. Ethiopia nevertheless went ahead and completed the initial filling of the dam.
Now, let's talk about new developments coming out of Ethiopia. We see that the feud between Ethiopian Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed and the ruling party in the very strategic Tigray region is escalating. Am I correct to suggest that we could see fears of Ethiopia breaking up?
Maybe fears of Ethiopia breaking up is a bit of an exaggeration, but certainly the Prime Minister turned it into a typical African dictator since I guess you could say about a year or so now. When he came to power, he came across as one of the most progressive, one of the most liberal prime minister who would really take a country in a completely different direction. But more recently, he has turned extremely authoritarian, arrested recently all the kind of major formidable political opposition that he has. And the Tigray region is one of the regions that retained a certain level of autonomy from all the regions. All the regions are completely under his control. So one of the disputes has been on the question of whether to postpone the election or not. The Prime Minister used his authority and a certain constitutional machination to postpone the election. The Tigray region said, no, we do not postpone the election. The conditions are right to hold the election. It is undemocratic to postpone the elections, and they decided to go ahead and hold the election. I think it's important to point out here that TPLF was the party that dominated the coalition that governed Ethiopia from 1991 until 2018. And throughout those periods, TPLF wasn't a political movement that was committed to democracy or the rule of law or human rights. Democracy or elections were not the most important agendas for them. Now, obviously, they are insisting on holding elections because their position has changed considerably in terms of their influence. They are now a party relegated to a region, but I think they are correct in insisting that elections must be held and there are conducive conditions on the ground to carry out the elections. So I think fears of Ethiopia breaking up is a bit exaggerated, but if the Prime Minister is to continue with this kind of highly authoritarian tendencies, and I think given Ethiopia's constitution itself provides for not only the right to self-determination, but also for the right to secession, certainly certain groups might insist on becoming independent states if the constitutional rights that are provided to them to govern themselves are not respected by the Prime Minister.
Well, the reason I'm asking this question, Dr. Awol, is the fact that, it's based on concerns, really, that the TPLF could laying the groundwork for the creation of a breakaway state with the parliament and government taking office without the blessing of the federal government. But in another development, the TPLF argues that the postponement of these elections was in breach of the constitution and will essentially make Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed an illegitimate ruler. What do you make of that?
I think the constitutional argument that the Prime Minister's mandate to govern Ethiopia after the 5th of October would expire, and therefore the Prime Minister would not have the authority to rule after that day, is a very legitimate constitutional issue that needs to be addressed. Now, obviously, what they did is that they presented the question of whether the election could be extended to what we call the constitutional inquiry. It is the equivalent of the constitutional court that you have in South Africa, which decides on constitutional disputes. And that body decided that elections can be extended and the term of the government can also be extended until those elections were held. But what was so problematic in that decision is that the council gave the authority to decide when elections will be held to a cabinet minister, that is to the Minister of Health, because the extension was justified in the name of the COVID-19 pandemic. And they said the only body that could decide when it is right to hold the election or safe to hold the election is the Minister of Health, which is a cabinet minister, and also have an interest in the outcome of the election. For that, there is no constitutional basis whatsoever. So the decision itself is disputed, but it is a decision that followed sort of a legal procedure. So the question of whether or not existing political parties, regional governments, other regional governments are under the control of the Prime Minister. But TPLF has been very clear in stating that the mandate of the government would expire on the 5th of October. And there are also other forces that are claiming or insisting that the Prime Minister's power would expire, that he would not have a mandate to govern. I think some of the jails and the arrests that have been made, particularly the repression in the Oromo region and against key leaders of the Oromo opposition parties, precisely because of fears that some individuals or groups might insist on a transitional government of some sort, because the government's authority to govern has expired.
Dr. Awol Allo, senior lecturer at the United Kingdom's Keele University, joining us via Skype. Thank you so much for your time. We appreciate your insight.
Thanks for having me.